After 1779, you saw more of the blue and buff. Sometimes they were blue and red. Militia, as I said, tended to not have uniforms. After the French joined the war, they began sending brown uniforms with red trim. So it's not like the British Army where everybody looks the same. Everybody's got a red coat. Everybody's got a black hat. Everybody's got white breeches. You didn't know what you were going to get. And supplies ran short among the Continentals, and sometimes they had very little clothes or no clothes. Some people, their uniform was a blanket that they threw around their naked body. Things get bad for a while. Muskets and other equipment were similar, except that the Americans are going to gradually use French muskets more and more, and French gunpowder, which were superior to their British equivalents. And why French, you ask? Well, you'll just have to wait and find out, listener.
That's right. No spoilers in this early episode. Right.
Why? How come French? We will tell you very, very soon. All right, that's my horrible French accent. My students always crack up when I try that one. All right, Continental soldiers, most of them were of British descent, but some were descended from other European nations. Kind of like in the British Army, there were Scots, there were Irish, there were Scots-Irish, but there were others as well. There were some Germans. Now, the British, I didn't mention this, the British also employed a lot of German mercenaries, which were generally called Hessians, and we will talk quite a bit about them later. So let's put them on the shelf for now. Back to the Americans. You had Native Americans or Indians that fought on both sides, and African Americans fought on both sides. When African Americans fought in the American Army, they fought in integrated units. They fought side by side with whites, and that is not going to happen after this war until the Korean War in 1950. So that's an interesting little fun fact there. Most Continentals were farmers, not surprising because most citizens were farmers. The average age was 21 for the American-born, but 29 for foreign-born. 14% of these foreign-born soldiers in the American Army were transported convicts who were sent to the colonies as indentured servants. So not always really nice guys, you know.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. But not too sad about taking a shot at the British.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of them really had a bone to pick with the British, so understandably so. So, many people who joined the Continental Army, as with the British, they did so for financial reasons. The bounties were a big draw. They kept having to grant larger and larger bounties or signing bonuses, if you will. Although the pay is going to be so irregular, we will see that American soldiers often go months without being paid. And when they do get paid, they get paid in Continental dollars, which, yeah.
They're like Confederate dollars, huh?
Yeah, pretty much. You know, they're kind of worth a little at the beginning, but by the end, they're so worthless that a saying sprang up called "worthless as a Continental." You know, the U.S. Army and the U.S. government in general was extremely cash strapped during this entire war. They do get a little bit of financial aid from the French and then later from other nations, but constant shortages of money as well as supplies. Now, with the officers, this was a little bit different. They weren't sold. So the Americans didn't just say, all right, who wants to be a general? Oh, okay. Give me 100 pounds or 200 pounds. They were usually given on the basis of merit. Although at the beginning of the war, as I touched upon earlier, a general might be somebody who was just a leading citizen, like a wealthy merchant. Washington was chosen because he had previous military experience. He had fought in the French and Indian War. Other soldiers like, I should say other officers, people like Charles Lee had been in the British Army. Horatio Gates had been in the British Army. Daniel Morgan, people like that. But a lot of people that ended up being American generals had no experience. They weren't all generals necessarily, but people like Henry Knox, he taught himself out of a book how to be a soldier, and he became very effective. Nathaniel Greene is the same way. Alexander Hamilton reached the rank of colonel. People like the Marquis de Lafayette, a very colorful character that we'll talk about later. He was granted a commission as a major general. he didn't have he was 19 years old when he came over. He didn't have time to have military experience hardly. But some of these, we saw in the Civil War that there were people that had no experience, but they were quick studies and they picked it up really quickly. And that's true in this war too. Whereas some of the professionals, people with military experience, like I'm talking to you, Charles Lee and Horatio Gates, they were terrible. So again, as in the Civil War, previous military experience did not necessarily mean you would be a superior commander to somebody who had no experience. A lot of American officers had been tradesmen. That amazed the British. The British soldiers would come over and they'd say, well, look, their generals they're merchants and they're shopkeepers and they're farmers and things like that. They're not soldiers. So that's the main difference, I would say, other than the fact that the British Army was equipped so much better than the American Army. Another major difference is that the British Army was a professional fighting force. These guys were pros, whereas the Americans were rookies at best. They were very few of them had been professional soldiers.
Well, I think throughout the series, James will provide a lot of the factual raw material here. And here and there, I can sprinkle in some of the historical theories and interpretations about what people think about different battles. But in light of what you explained here about how poorly equipped the Continental soldiers are, they have no supplies, they seem to have no money at many times during the war. It's led many historians to put forth theories of how on earth did the Americans win? Some have argued that when the British increased troop strength in the middle of the war in order to knock the Americans out, they were in the Carolinas. It had been irrigated, leading to swamp conditions and lots of mosquitoes, so many of them died of malaria. So that to say that some historians blame it on environmental conditions that knocked out the British, not necessarily the superior tactics or superior bravery of the Americans. So I say a lot to say that the plausibility of an alternate theory than the fighting ability of the Continental Army seems plausible to a lot of historians because the odds are heavily stacked against them, or at least it looks like they're not in a shape to win a war, at least at first. So it's an uphill battle right here.
Yeah, and the Continental Army, they're going to get better. They're going to get a lot better. When I said they were a bunch of amateurs and rookies, that was certainly true in 75, 76. But later on, we're going to see that Washington and some other people are going to whip them into shape. And by the end of the war, the American Army is probably as good as any army in the world. I don't know, I may be exaggerating there, but they're certainly equal to the British.
All right. Well, that is an overview of British and Continental soldiers. We're going to get into the war in the next episode with Bunker Hill, and we're going to give a formal and proper introduction to George Washington. All right. Well, that wraps up our exploration of the past for this episode. As always, I want to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, especially our spy masters, Todd Warren, Jake Harrington, Beverly Engel, Bill Ivey, Joyce Norman, Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Baron Fraser, Chris from Maine, Carl from Norway, Moondoggy from Ohio, Rick Knowlton, Vic and Irene, Mike from New York, Michelle, and Marlene. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to public.com and look for History Unplugged, or you just go to historyonthenet.com and look for our store there. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books, Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is, you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.